Well, hello everybody. Guess I started talking prematurely and never bothered to press record. So here I go again. I'd love it if I could be able to do this the first time out. We're talking about the section on farming right now, and this is a very complex section, so I've used the lectures that I have through PowerPoint to try and organize the material that is found in your book. Hopefully that'll be some help because there is so much there that the lectures will enable you to focus your readings. One of the things that I want to talk about very briefly is the fact that domestication of plants and animals was independently invented in many parts of the world. Yes, it is true that diffusion takes place, that people borrow from each other. They borrow things, they borrow ideas, sometimes population moves. But the bottom line here is that in many parts of the world, the hunters and gatherers which lived in those locations were, because of perhaps reasons that are not clear to us right now, were able to develop their own domestication of plants and animals, which were important to them to a greater or lesser extent. It's very interesting how with early farming, even when early farming is actually cemented in that society, that at least for a while people still use hunting and gathering, fishing, to supplement their dietary needs. Eventually, of course, if we look at the big farmers and the big uses of plant foods in society, for example, we now find that hunting and gathering would be untenable to support the huge populations that exist today. And they wouldn't even be able to supplement. Think about wherever you live. If suddenly people just had to live by hunting and gathering, you'd probably run out of those plants and animals very quickly, especially if you have a very large population. If you have a very small rural population, maybe not. But even then, the things that we're used to eating are often traded in from someplace else. It's all very good to say eat locally, but for many of us, there's really not a lot of local food available in the wintertime. We have to depend upon those farmers that are in other parts of our country, other parts of the world to supply us with food. And that's an important key. That's one of the advantages of the kind of domestication of plants and animals that we see in perhaps the last 1% of human existence. It's the production of food surpluses that make it possible for me to be a teacher, for some of you to become teachers, in other words, craft specialists, to work in criminal justice or in social work or as psychologists. These are all, and of course I may not have mentioned your major, but the bottom line is that every environmental specialist, all of us are able to be students, to pursue our professions because somebody else is doing the work of providing us with food. And it may be that some of you have a garden, and it may be that you depend upon the products of those gardens. But for the most part, most of us go to the supermarket and we are dependent upon those products that are there. And then the garden kind of supplements and makes us feel good. Now, again, some of you may actually be providing for yourself, but you're in the great minority. So those surpluses are very important. It's those surpluses that enable us to develop state-level society, which we're going to be talking about in the next and last section of the book. So I'd just like for you to be aware of the importance of food surpluses. However, please pay attention to those parts of the book in the lecture that talk about the price that we pay for depending upon domestication of plants and animals. Farmers often have a very poor diet. They tend to focus on one particular kind of food and therefore suffer from nutritional deficiencies. This is going on even today. Farmers have changes in growth patterns. Farmers are subject to the vagaries of weather and indeed famine, be it man-made produced famine or naturally produced famine. These are all things that are talked about in the book and in the lecture. So please pay attention to this. We tend to think of farming as being a superior way of life, and for our kind of society, with our population's densities, we cannot get along without it. But the bottom line is that if you compare the amount of time that hunter and gatherers spent on procuring their food, some of the quality of the food that was produced by hunters and gatherers, in many respects, this was, for those smaller population densities, the way to go. But that is just not possible anymore. So please pay attention to the book and to the lecture, because we do talk about these issues. In the remaining time, I just thought I would mention my impressions of Stonehenge, where I've been 3 times, each time with a class. And I guess my first impression of Stonehenge, most famous rock group in the world, perhaps, my first impression was how small it was. Because when you look at it, the rocks don't seem to be that big, and yet when you really get into the statistics, you find that each of those stones weighs many tons. You start looking at the place more carefully, and you begin to discover that it wasn't built all at once. It was a series of construction efforts. If you look at it even more closely, you're going to see that the stones are using woodworking techniques, or at least images that we find in woodworking are being reproduced in the stone. So the technique of mortise and tenon, of having a knob, let's see if I can do this, a knob and then a cup fitting into that mortise and tenon joints, the top lintels fitting onto the bottom stones. These are tried and true woodworking techniques that are applied to this very hard stone. Furthermore, we have the issue of force perspective. When you get closer to the stones, they appear to be taller than they really are. And part of that is because of the way they've been curved and the way they've been tapered near the top. So it gives us the illusion that they're actually taller than they are and reach for the sky more than they do. Something that Disney World would understand very clearly, because they create these illusions all of the time. And I guess the final thing about Stonehenge that I wanted to mention was that everybody, almost everybody that was there each of the 3 times, was in awe of the place. They were in awe of the stones and the shape. And I could smell sweat. I could hear the noises of the people grunting as they move those stones over huge distances to get them to that place. These stones are not native to that particular locality. And I started questioning, how did they move those stones? How did they get them upright? Given that they had the stone tools with which to work, how were they able to create that tapering effect? How were they able to produce those mortises and tenons? We know that at least one case they had to start over again because the measurements were wrong. And they went to a great deal of work to create one of these depressions, and then stopped and moved over to another location nearby as to make the fit proper. So there's a lot of care going on, a lot of hard work, and the bottom line was, where do these people live? Everywhere people looked, they felt Stonehenge. This is just looking at the tourists that were around me. Stonehenge, they looked around and said, wow, this is an isolated spiritual place. Yes, it is a spiritual place, but it's certainly not isolated, because if you look at the Salisbury Plain, you see many other ritual sites which existed at the same time periods, which may and have, in fact, have been interrelated. What about the settlements? People had to live somewhere. Somebody had to feed them. They had to stay. They had to sleep for the night, refresh themselves. And within the past few years, there have been a number of important excavations in the Salisbury Plain, especially at Durrington Walls, that have found those settlements. And National Geographic has been really good at documenting some of this, as well as some of the blogs. So look up Stonehenge settlement if you have the time. It's certainly not required, and you might find just how rich and complicated the lives of the builders of Stonehenge really were. I'll stop right here. Take care, everybody.